Tonight, we will tell you a story from a time when the rhythm of life was dictated not by kings or conquerors, but by the capricious grace of the earth itself. A story of the Middle Ages, when the shadow of famine was a constant looming presence. You will learn how communities, built on the fragile foundation of a single harvest, were plunged into an abyss of hunger. You will discover the subtle, insidious signs that heralded the coming disaster, how the everyday foods disappeared one by one, and what people resorted to eating when the conventional world offered nothing but emptiness. We will explore the desperation that pushed human beings to the very edge of survival, forcing them to break taboos, adapt in unimaginable ways, and confront the raw, unyielding power of nature's indifference. Oh, and if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the depths of history, helping you find peace and understanding before sleep, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. Your support truly helps these stories reach more listeners. All right? Find a comfortable spot, let your body relax into the surface beneath you, and allow your breath to slow. Close your eyes if you wish. For in the medieval world, the concept of food security was a fragile dream, constantly threatened by forces beyond human control. The rhythm of life in the Middle Ages, for the vast majority of people, was dictated by the land. You lived close to the soil, and your very existence hinged upon its bounty. The typical medieval diet, especially for the common peasant, was remarkably consistent, built around a very specific foundation: grains. Imagine your days framed by the cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. Most of your caloric intake, the very energy that fueled your body for long hours of arduous labor, came from cereals like wheat, barley, rye, and oats. These were not simply ingredients. They were the bedrock of survival, the constant presence on every table, shaping the very nature of daily life. From these grains, you would bake your daily bread. This was not the light, airy bread many know today, but often a coarse, dark loaf, dense and heavy, providing sustained energy. It was the most fundamental part of every meal, eaten at breakfast, midday, and evening. Or perhaps you would prepare thick porridges, simmering slowly over an open fire in a simple cauldron, their warmth a comfort in chilly homes. These porridges might be mixed with a bit of milk, if you were fortunate enough to have a cow or a goat, lending them a richer texture and flavor, or more often, just water, combined with whatever vegetables were in season. Alongside these indispensable staples, your diet would include legumes, peas and beans, which were vital sources of protein and fiber, easily grown and stored. Seasonal vegetables like cabbages, onions, carrots, and leeks were cultivated in small, hand-tended garden plots adjacent to your humble dwelling. Their earthy smells would fill the air during cooking, a simple, consistent part of your sustenance. Fruit, when available, was a rare and precious treat, often foraged from wild trees or cultivated in small orchards, but its season was fleeting, a brief burst of sweetness before the long, savory months returned. Beyond solid food, your primary drink was often ale or beer, brewed from grains. This was not just for pleasure, it was a safer alternative to often contaminated water, and provided additional calories, a liquid form of sustenance that was consumed by adults and even children. Sweeteners were virtually unknown to the common folk, and spices, if they existed in your home, were likely grown in your own herb garden, far from the exotic luxuries of the wealthy. Meat was not a daily affair for most. If you were a peasant, You might have a few chickens scratching in the yard, providing eggs and occasional meat, and perhaps a pig, which would be slaughtered once a year. The pig's meat would be carefully cured and preserved, smoked or salted, to last through the leaner, colder months of winter, a precious store of fat and protein. Fish, if you lived near a river or the coast, could supplement this, especially on the numerous fast days mandated by the church when meat was forbidden. Dairy products, such as fresh milk, cheese, and butter, were also important, providing crucial fats and nutrients. But again, their availability depended on possessing livestock, which not every household could afford or maintain through harsh winters. This profound reliance on locally grown food created an inherent and deeply rooted vulnerability. Each community, whether a small village nestled by a forest or a slightly larger market town, was, in essence, an island of sustenance, reliant almost entirely on the produce of its immediate surroundings. There was no vast interconnected global food supply chain as we know it today, ready to reroute provisions at a moment's notice. Transportation was agonizingly slow, laborious, and expensive. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, impassable in bad weather, and river transport, while more efficient, was limited to specific routes. Moving large quantities of food over long distances was an immense logistical challenge, often prohibitively costly and time-consuming. This meant that if the harvest failed in your particular village or region, there was no easy way to import grain from a neighboring province, let alone from across a kingdom or continent. You stood or fell, survived or perished, with the success of your local fields. The concept of food security in this era was a fragile one, constantly balanced on the knife edge of a good harvest. Farmers practiced what is often called subsistence farming, meaning they grew just enough to feed themselves and their families, with only a small precarious surplus left over to pay rents or taxes to their lord or to trade for other basic necessities like tools or salt. This left very little buffer against misfortune. A single bad year, even a slightly below average one, could quickly deplete any stored reserves. Granaries, which were vital communal or lordly storage facilities, were built with thick, cold stone walls to protect the precious excess from previous years, acting as a crucial lifeline in times of scarcity. But these too had their limits. They were susceptible to dampness, to rodents, to insect infestations, and to the simple finite nature of space. A prolonged period of poor yields would inevitably empty them, leaving nothing but dust and despair. When the rains failed to come, leaving the soil cracked and dry, or when they fell too heavily and incessantly, washing away newly sown seeds and drowning young crops in a sea of mud, a cold dread would begin to spread through the villages. When unseasonal frosts blighted the burgeoning plants, or when pests, like hordes of locusts or insidious blight, descended upon the fields, silently devouring the very plants that sustained life, the signs of impending disaster were unmistakable. These were not isolated incidents that could be easily overcome. The entire fabric of society was interwoven with the success or failure of the agricultural year. A single season of poor yields could set off a devastating chain reaction, leading to widespread hunger. 2 or 3 such seasons in a row, and the specter of famine, a word that would chill the bones of any medieval person, would become a terrifying, undeniable reality. The vulnerability was absolute. Your life, your children's lives, The very fabric of your village depended on the fickle generosity of the sun, the rain, and the soil. There was no extensive scientific understanding of crop rotation, soil enrichment, or effective pest control. Farmers worked with traditional knowledge, passed down through generations, but they were largely at the mercy of nature's unpredictable whims. And when these elements turned against you, the brutal struggle for survival began. It was a struggle that would force people to make unimaginable choices, to push past the boundaries of what was considered edible, and to face the raw, unyielding truth of human desperation. The slow, creeping onset of famine was not a sudden catastrophe that struck without warning. It was a gradual strangulation, beginning with the quiet depletion of the stores, leading inexorably to the desperate, frantic search for anything, absolutely anything, that might offer a moment's sustenance, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing emptiness within. The very foundation of medieval life, as you now understand, rested precariously on the success of each year's harvest. When the granaries were full and the fields yielded their bounty, communities thrived, albeit modestly. But this delicate balance was perpetually threatened by forces beyond human control, primarily the unpredictable whims of the weather. The onset of famine was rarely a sudden cataclysmic event. Instead, it was a slow, creeping dread, heralded by a series of unmistakable, escalating warning signs that began with the first faltering harvest. Imagine the late spring, a time when the new shoots should be vibrant green, promising abundance. But instead, a persistent, chilling rain might fall day after day, week after week. This damp cold, seeping into the soil, would waterlog the fields, causing precious seeds to rot before they could even sprout, or encouraging fungal diseases that blackened emerging stalks. Or perhaps a searing drought would bake the earth hard, cracking the surface and shriveling young plants under an unrelenting sun, turning fertile soil to dust. A single such season, a solitary bad harvest, would not typically lead to immediate starvation. Most households, and certainly the local lords and monasteries, maintained a strategic reserve of grain stored from previous successful years. This surplus, often kept in cool, dark stone granaries, was the buffer against lean times. So, after one poor yield, people would begin to draw upon these stores, tightening their belts, perhaps selling fewer pigs or chickens, but largely managing to endure. The immediate consequence would be a noticeable, but not yet catastrophic, rise in the price of bread and other staples at the local market. There would be whispers of concern, a quiet anxiety settling over the village, a shared glance of worry among neighbors, but life would continue, albeit with a new edge of apprehension. The true alarm bells began to sound with the second consecutive bad harvest. If the following year brought similar misfortune, another season of relentless rain turning fields into muddy quagmires, hindering planting, or a harsh, unseasonable frost that struck too early or too late, blackening tender crops just as they ripened, then the situation turned dire. The precious reserves, already depleted from the previous year, would now be dangerously low or entirely exhausted. The seeds that should have been carefully saved for the next planting season might have been consumed out of sheer necessity, out of the gnawing hunger that forced impossible choices. This decision, born of immediate hunger, sealed the fate of the coming year, creating a vicious cycle of scarcity that was difficult to break. With no stored grain to fall back on and the prospect of future harvest already compromised, the prices of food would skyrocket beyond what was known. What once cost a few pennies might now demand silver, placing it entirely out of reach for the majority of the peasant population who lived hand to mouth. The market stalls would grow emptier, the usual bustling trade replaced by anxious haggling or despairing silence, the air thick with unspoken fear. This compounding effect of successive crop failures was the true harbinger of widespread hunger. It wasn't just staple grains like wheat, barley, and rye that suffered, which formed the bulk of the medieval diet. The persistent foul weather affected everything. Hay, vital for feeding livestock through the long, cold winter, would be scarce, leading to the early slaughter of animals or their slow, agonizing starvation. The sight of emaciated cattle staggering in the fields or the stench of dead livestock became grim indicators of the deepening crisis, removing another crucial source of protein and fat. Gardens, too, would fail, their vegetables stunted or withered, offering no supplement to dwindling bread. The wild fruits and berries that people might normally forage for supplement would also be affected by the same adverse weather patterns, offering little relief and often elusive. Fish, a common protein source in coastal areas or rivers, could also be impacted by environmental changes or simply overfished in times of desperation. As food became scarcer and prices soared, the social fabric began to fray at the edges. You would see more and more people abandoning their small plots of land, too weak or disheartened to work them, and migrating towards the nearest towns or cities, hoping to find charity or work, or a crumb of bread. These urban centers, however, were themselves struggling with dwindling supplies and rising populations, often leading to overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and tension. Beggars would multiply on the streets, their pleas more desperate, their eyes sunken. Children, their faces gaunt, their bellies swollen, would follow the scent of any cooking fire, however faint. Theft of food, once a rare and severely punished offense, would become increasingly common, a desperate act of survival. The communal spirit, so vital in rural medieval life, would begin to erode under the weight of individual desperation. Neighbors, who once shared freely, would now hoard their meager provisions, their eyes hardening with suspicion and self-preservation. The lords and landed gentry, while better off due to their larger landholdings, would also feel the pinch, their incomes from rents and produce diminishing, making them less inclined or able to offer aid to their suffering tenants, even if they wished. The signs were everywhere, the empty granaries, the silent mills, the skeletal animals, the desperate faces in the streets, the quiet sobbing. These were the early, chilling whispers of a catastrophe that was about to engulf the land, transforming the very act of eating into a desperate struggle for survival. The stage was set for a hunger unlike any most had ever known, a hunger that would force people to contemplate choices once unimaginable, pushing the boundaries of food. The vulnerabilities of medieval society, though ever present, sometimes culminated in catastrophes of unprecedented scale, transforming widespread hunger into an all-consuming despair. The sheer scale of the disaster was unimaginable, a relentless, creeping horror that touched every single life. One such cataclysmic event, known to history as the Great Famine, descended upon Europe with an unforgiving brutality between the years 1315 and 1317, though its devastating effects lingered for much longer. This was not merely a local hardship. It was a continent-spanning tragedy that left millions dead and fundamentally reshaped the collective memory of an entire generation. Its origins lay not in human conflict, but in the subtle yet profound shifts of the climate itself. For several decades prior, Europe had enjoyed a relatively warm and stable period, conducive to agriculture and population growth. But around the turn of the 14th century, a colder, wetter pattern began to emerge, part of what later historians would identify as the early stages of the Little Ice Age. In the spring of 1315, the weather turned exceptionally severe. Instead of the gentle rains that nurtured young crops, torrential downpours began. These were not brief showers. They were relentless, day after day, week after week. The ground became saturated. Fields turned into muddy bogs, and rivers overflowed their banks, inundating vast stretches of arable land. The critical planting season was ruined. Farmers, already struggling with the previous year's diminished yields, watched helplessly as their newly sown seeds either rotted in the waterlogged soil or were washed away entirely. Even for those crops that managed to sprout, the persistent lack of sunshine and warmth stunted their growth. The summer of 1315 brought no respite. The rains continued, cold and unyielding. Grains like wheat, barley, and rye, which formed the bedrock of the medieval diet, could not ripen properly. They became waterlogged, prone to fungal diseases, and produced meager, nutrient-poor harvests. What little was gathered quickly spoiled in storage due to the pervasive dampness. The impact extended beyond the fields. The incessant rain and cold devastated livestock. Pastures became waterlogged, and fodder supplies dwindled. Sheep, cattle, and pigs, vital sources of protein and fat, succumbed to disease, exposure, and starvation. Their emaciated carcasses became a common, grim sight, further diminishing the food supply and spreading illness. The loss of draft animals, oxen and horses, crippled agricultural efforts, making it even harder to prepare fields for the next planting season, perpetuating the cycle of scarcity. This relentless climatic assault swept across the entire continent, from the emerald fields of Ireland and the misty valleys of Scotland, through the bustling towns of England and France, across the Germanic lands in Scandinavia, and eastward into parts of Poland and Russia. The story was tragically the same. Villages that had once been self-sufficient suddenly found themselves facing an empty larder. The intricate yet fragile network of medieval trade, which relied heavily on local surpluses, quickly broke down. Regions that might have had a marginally better harvest found it impossible to transport food to the worst-hit areas as roads turned to impassable quagmires and rivers raged. The immediate devastation was swift and brutal. Prices for what little grain remained skyrocketed, placing it far beyond the reach of ordinary people. The poor, who lived hand to mouth, even in good times, were the first to starve. Their meager savings, if they had any, were quickly exhausted on a single loaf of bread. As granaries emptied and markets offered nothing but exorbitantly priced moldy remnants, a profound sense of panic set in. People began to wander, abandoning their homes in search of food, only to find the same desperate conditions elsewhere. Families broke apart as parents, unable to feed their children, made agonizing choices, sometimes leaving infants by the roadside in the vain hope that someone else might offer them sustenance, or selling older children into servitude for a handful of grain. The social fabric began to fray, stretched to its breaking point by the primal fear of starvation. The year 1316 brought no relief. The weather remained stubbornly cold and wet, ensuring another catastrophic harvest. It was a prolonged agony, stretching over 2 full years of failed crops, before a slight reprieve in 1317 offered a glimmer of hope, though recovery would take many more years, and the memory of the great famine would cast a long, chilling shadow over Europe for generations. The sheer number of lives lost during this period is difficult to precisely quantify, but estimates suggest that between 10 to 25% of the population in some regions perished, a scale of mortality that would only be surpassed by the Black Death decades later. The Great Famine was a stark, undeniable reminder of humanity's fragile dependence on the whims of nature and the limits of medieval society's ability to withstand such an overwhelming environmental shock. Every community, from the grandest city to the smallest hamlet, felt its icy grip, forcing people to confront the most fundamental question of survival. As the relentless rains continued and the sun remained hidden, the immediate, devastating impact of the Great Famine of 1315 began to unfold across the villages and towns of Europe. The first and most critical food source to vanish was, of course, grain. For the vast majority of medieval people, life revolved around bread. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats were not merely components of their diet. They were the very foundation of their existence, providing the bulk of their calories and sustaining their daily labor. Most households had a small store of grain, perhaps enough to last a few months, carefully rationed after the harvest. But the harvests of 1315 had been catastrophic, and those of 1316 were even worse, leaving fields waterlogged and crops rotting in the ground. The initial shock was the sheer lack of new grain. Then, the existing reserves, meager as they were, began to dwindle with alarming speed. Villagers watched their granaries empty, sacks of precious kernels shrinking day by day. The price of what little grain could be found skyrocketed, putting it far out of reach for ordinary families. Those who once traded surplus for other goods now had nothing to offer. The first hunger pangs were felt by the poorest, the landless laborers and urban beggars. But soon the gnawing emptiness spread to every household. The comforting aroma of baking bread, once a constant presence in every community, became a distant memory, replaced by the hollow ache of starvation. People ate their seed grain, sacrificing the promise of a future harvest for a few days of survival, a desperate act that only deepened the crisis for the following year. This was the first, most immediate, and most terrifying sign that the world they knew was crumbling. When the grain was gone, or too expensive to buy, the next line of defense against starvation was the livestock. Animals were a living larder, a source of meat, milk, and eggs, but also crucial for labor, wool, and leather. The decision to slaughter an animal was not taken lightly, as it meant sacrificing future productivity and wealth. A cow provided milk, a calf, and pulled a plow. A pig could forage and fatten. Sheep provided wool and lambs. But as the famine deepened, these considerations faded before the stark reality of hunger. Families began to slaughter their animals one by one. First, perhaps, an old hen, then a pig, then a sheep. The meat, though a temporary reprieve, was quickly consumed, often shared among desperate neighbors or traded for minuscule amounts of other dwindling resources. Cattle, being larger and more valuable, were typically the last to be sacrificed, representing a family's most significant asset. The sight of emaciated cattle, once symbols of prosperity, being led to slaughter, became common in every village. Many animals, weakened by lack of fodder, for the harvests had also failed to produce enough hay and feed, died from starvation or disease, their carcasses quickly becoming a grim source of food for the starving. The pastures that usually sustained them were barren or waterlogged, offering no sustenance. The air, once filled with the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep, grew eerily quiet as animal populations plummeted. The widespread slaughter of livestock led to a cascade of problems. No milk for children, no oxen to plow fields, no manure to fertilize the exhausted soil. This depletion of animal capital not only offered a temporary, insufficient solution to hunger, but also severely crippled the agricultural recovery, ensuring that the famine's effects would linger for years beyond the immediate period of scarcity. After grain and livestock, people turned to whatever stored provisions they might have had. In better times, medieval households preserved food for the lean winter months. This included salted meat, dried fish, cheese, and a limited array of root vegetables like turnips and carrots, if they had been successfully grown and stored in root cellars. These were not primary food sources, but rather supplements or emergency rations. During the famine, these stores, which might have once seemed ample, vanished in a matter of days or weeks. Every jar, every barrel, every dark corner of the pantry was scoured for anything edible. Dried beans, peas, and lentils, normally a staple for the poor, became precious commodities, consumed quickly and rarely replenished. People also ate food that was not fully mature, pulling up young plants and picking unripe fruits, desperate for any calories, even if it meant sacrificing the potential for a larger, more nutritious harvest later. The stores of ale and beer, which were often brewed from grain and provided some nutritional value and safe hydration, also ran out as the barley and oats needed for their production became unobtainable. The desperation was palpable as families emptied their larders, knowing that once these last conventional provisions were gone, there would be nothing left but the gnawing emptiness of profound hunger. The silence of the empty barns and the hollow echo of empty cellars became a grim testament to the famine's relentless march. The period of conventional food consumption had come to an end. All that remained were the most desperate, unthinkable options, pushing people to the very edge of survival and morality. When the granaries stood empty and the last of the livestock, even the smallest chickens and scrawniest pigs, had been consumed, a profound silence often fell upon the medieval villages and towns. It was a silence broken only by the gnawing ache of hunger, a constant companion that stole sleep and sharpened senses, turning every rustle of leaves into a potential discovery, every distant sound into a possible source of food. The fields, once fertile and promising, now offered nothing but barren soil or the ghosts of withered crops, their stalks brittle and dry, long since picked clean of any stray grain. It was at this point, when all conventional sources of sustenance had been exhausted, when the last morsel of stored food was gone, that human ingenuity, driven by the most primal instinct for survival, turned desperately to the wild world around them. Families, weakened by weeks and months of meager rations, their bodies gaunt and their faces etched with profound desperation, would rouse themselves at dawn. Their eyes, once bright with the tasks of farming or craft, were now hollow and perpetually searching, scanning the horizon for any sign of life, any whisper of a green shoot. They would begin to scour the landscape, often traveling miles from their homes, their steps slow and deliberate, conserving what little energy they possessed. Their traditional knowledge, often passed down through generations, about the properties of local plants, about the secrets of the forest, became their only guide. The forests, the riverbanks, the ditches, the boggy marshes, and even the edges of the roads and the crumbling walls of ancient ruins became their new hunting grounds, each one meticulously examined for anything edible. Roots were among the first targets, often the most reliable source of calories when above-ground vegetation had withered. People would dig tirelessly into the cold, damp earth, their hands often bare and raw, searching for anything that might offer even a fleeting promise of nourishment. Wild parsnips, though often smaller, tougher, and more fibrous than their cultivated counterparts, were prized for their starchy content. The roots of common nettles, usually avoided for their stinging leaves, were dug up with care, then boiled repeatedly to remove their irritants, their inherent bitterness ignored in the face of gnawing starvation. Even the gnarled roots of certain thistles, normally dismissed as stubborn weeds, were cleaned, pounded, and chewed, providing a meager, almost negligible amount of sustenance. This was back-breaking work, each hour yielding precious little for the immense effort expended. The soil itself seemed to yield up its secrets grudgingly, as if even the very earth itself was weary of human suffering. When roots became scarce, or the ground too frozen and unyielding to dig, attention turned to the trees, a sign of truly desperate times. Bark, particularly the inner layer known as cambium, from young elm, birch, or pine trees, became a desperate food source. The cambium, a thin, moist layer found just beneath the outer bark, was carefully scraped away with knives, or even with bare fingernails if no tools remained. This fibrous material, though containing only a small amount of nutrients and carbohydrates, was vital. It would be laboriously dried, then painstakingly ground into a crude, rough flour using stones, or whatever implements were available. This bark flour was then often mixed with whatever dried leaves, moss, or even powdered bones could be found. The resulting paste or flatbread was coarse, gritty, and offered little comfort or flavor, but it was something to fill the stomach, a temporary reprieve from the relentless pangs of hunger. Its taste was often acrid, resinous, and extremely difficult to digest, causing further internal distress. But at this stage, taste was utterly irrelevant. The very act of stripping bark from trees left visible scars on the landscape, a testament to the extent of the suffering. Wild berries, if the season allowed, were eagerly sought out, though often they were consumed long before they reached ripeness, or were varieties known to cause mild discomfort or stomach upset in normal times. Blackberries, raspberries, and wild currants, often still green, shriveled, or frost-bitten, were consumed quickly, their fleeting sweetness a rare and precious treat. But the danger of mistaking a poisonous berry for an edible one was ever present, a silent threat lurking in every thicket. Yet, the risk was often deemed acceptable when faced with the absolute certainty of imminent starvation. People learned to identify a few safe varieties, passing on this vital, dangerous knowledge, but even then, the yield was often meager and quickly depleted by the desperate masses. Beyond roots, bark, and berries, every green thing, every leaf, every stalk, became a potential meal. Wild greens like sorrel, dandelion leaves, and shepherd's purse were gathered by the handful, eaten raw if possible, or boiled into a watery gruel. Lichens, those peculiar crusty growths on rocks and trees, were scraped off and boiled, though their nutritional value was minimal, and their preparation often required extensive boiling to remove bitter compounds or even mild toxins. Mosses, too, were sometimes collected and prepared, offering bulk more than sustenance, their spongy texture providing a false sense of fullness. The sheer volume of these plants required to provide any meaningful calories was immense, and the act of gathering them consumed precious energy that the starving bodies barely possessed, often leading to further exhaustion. The search for these unconventional foods was not a quiet, leisurely stroll through nature. It was a desperate, competitive scramble, a daily battle for survival. Every patch of forest, every riverbank, every neglected corner of the landscape was systematically scoured, often leaving nothing behind. Communities that once shared resources now found themselves competing fiercely for the last edible root, the last patch of berries, or the last strip of bark. Children, lighter and often more agile, were sent into the dense undergrowth, their small hands searching for anything overlooked by the adults, their innocence stripped away by the harsh realities of hunger. The air itself seemed to carry the scent of damp earth, desperation, and the faint, bitter aroma of boiled weeds. This relentless foraging transformed the landscape. What little wild edible vegetation existed was quickly stripped bare, leaving behind a denuded and desolate environment. The forests, once a source of game and timber, became a source of leaves and bark, their very fabric being consumed by the desperate population. The knowledge of which plants could be eaten, and which were deadly, became a matter of life and death, often learned through bitter, tragic experience. Many fell ill from consuming toxic plants, or from the sheer indigestibility of their desperate meals, their weakened bodies unable to cope with the unusual fare. Diarrhea, vomiting, and internal pain became common, further accelerating the decline of health. The shift to foraging was a clear indicator of how deeply a community had fallen into the abyss of famine. It marked the point where the familiar order of life had broken down entirely, replaced by a primal struggle for existence, where the human body was pushed to its absolute limits, sustained only by the meager, often unpalatable, and sometimes dangerous offerings of the wild. It was a time of profound physical and psychological exhaustion, a period where the line between what was considered food and what was merely edible blurred beyond recognition. And even these desperate measures, this tireless scouring of the land, often proved insufficient to keep life flickering within the starving bodies. The next stage of survival, therefore, became even more grim. pushing people to consume what was truly unthinkable in normal times. When the wild bounty of the forests and fields began to dwindle, and even the most obscure roots, leaves, and fungi had been gathered and consumed, people were forced to turn their gaze upon creatures they would normally never consider as food. This marked a terrifying new stage in the famine's relentless grip, a profound descent into desperation where the primal urge for survival overshadowed all former revulsion, custom, or even affection. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, stripped bare, offering no further solace. You see, the medieval world, while resourceful in its agricultural practices and often frugal, held clear societal norms about what was acceptable to eat. There were distinctions between clean and unclean animals, between those raised for consumption and those that were simply part of the background, or even pests to be eliminated. But as hunger gnawed relentlessly, an incessant, agonizing pain that permeated every waking moment, these deeply ingrained norms began to crumble. The first creatures to be sought, once the fields and larders were truly bare, were often those considered vermin, small animals that lived alongside humans but were generally despised, ignored, or actively persecuted. Rats, with their furtive movements in the shadows of barns, cellars, and houses, creatures of the night, became a desperate target. People set crude traps, waited silently for hours in the cold, or even chased them through the dim light of their homes. Mice, even smaller and more difficult to catch, were hunted with a new intense focus, their tiny bodies offering only the merest fleeting morsel of sustenance. Pigeons, nesting in the eaves of cottages and the high towers of churches, once perhaps a common nuisance or a source of sport, were now seen as a source of precious, life-sustaining protein. People would climb, stretch, and contrive precarious ways to reach their nests. Crows, often associated with ill omens in the dark side of nature, were nevertheless pursued for their meat, however tough or unappetizing it might be. These were not considered clean animals by any stretch of the imagination, but in a world where starvation was a daily agonizing threat, such distinctions quickly lost all meaning. Every desperate effort was made to trap, snare, or hunt these small, elusive creatures, offering a momentary, fleeting reprieve from the gnawing emptiness that consumed every waking thought. The usual sounds of farm life vanished, replaced by the rustle of desperate hands searching for anything that moved, anywhere. As even these meager and undesirable sources became scarce, and the landscape was stripped bare of any life that could be caught, the truly unthinkable began to happen. The profound bonds between humans and their domestic animals, relationships forged over centuries of shared life, labor, and companionship, began to fray and ultimately break under the immense pressure of hunger. Dogs, once loyal companions, vigilant guards of the home, or indispensable herders of livestock, found themselves viewed through a different, terrifying lens. Their barks, once comforting, now signaled a potential meal. Cats, traditionally valued for their ability to control rodent populations and sometimes kept as cherished, if aloof, pets, were no longer safe. Their soft fur and purring presence offered no protection against the depths of human despair. These animals, often lean themselves from the general scarcity of food, still offered a substantial amount of sustenance compared to a single root or a handful of scavenged berries. The decision to consume a beloved pet was rarely, if ever, made lightly. It was a profound act of despair, a testament to the absolute extremity of the situation gripping entire communities. It spoke of a world where compassion, companionship, and even long-held personal attachments had been forced to yield to the most fundamental, overwhelming drive for biological survival. The emotional cost of such an act was immense, leaving deep scars on the psyche, but the physical need was, by then, an unbearable torment that overrode all other considerations. The quiet cries of hungry children or the silent, gaunt faces of family members made the choice, however heartbreaking, unavoidable for many, a shared, unspoken horror. Yet, even this was not the lowest point to which the famine could drive human beings. As the scarcity intensified further and living creatures of any kind became almost impossible to find, people resorted to what was truly forbidden, dangerous, and utterly repugnant: carrion. This meant consuming the decaying flesh of animals that had already died, often from disease, exhaustion, or starvation. The risks associated with such consumption were enormous and immediate. The meat would be putrid, often discolored and foul-smelling, teeming with bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Eating it would almost certainly lead to severe illness, often dysentery, fever, or other infections, which in turn, in a weakened state, would frequently prove fatal. But in the face of certain agonizing death from starvation, the immediate, horrifying risk of illness became secondary. A decaying carcass, whether of a horse that had collapsed from exhaustion on a muddy road, a cow that had succumbed to illness in a barren pasture, or even a smaller animal found by the roadside, represented a final, desperate, and often futile chance at survival. It was a stark and horrifying sign that the very fabric of society, and indeed the boundaries of human behavior, were stretching to their absolute breaking point. The stench alone would have been enough to deter anyone not facing imminent death, yet the hunger, a relentless and all-consuming force, was a more powerful driver than revulsion or even the instinct for self-preservation. This was the ultimate degradation, a stark and unforgettable illustration of how far hunger could drive individuals, pushing them beyond the boundaries of sanitation, beyond accepted morality, and even beyond the rational fear of death, all for a fleeting, often ill-fated chance at enduring just one more day, one more agonizing hour, in a world consumed by quiet despair. As the famine deepened, and the very ground yielded nothing more, people found themselves facing choices that challenged the core of their humanity. The stages of desperation had been clear, a grim progression that stripped away layers of civilization and decency. First, the precious grain stores emptied, their dusty bins echoing with the silence of absence. Then, the livestock vanished, slaughtered one by one, their meat offering only a fleeting reprieve. Following this, the silent forests, once symbols of abundance, were stripped bare of their bark and roots, their wild berries and fungi consumed with desperate haste. The fields, picked clean of even the most bitter weeds, offered no solace. Then came the unthinkable, the consumption of pests, of rats and mice that once scurried unseen, of domestic pets that had shared their hearths, or the grim discovery of carrion, scavenged from the roadside. But there were moments in the darkest corners of this widespread catastrophe when even these extreme limits were surpassed, and the very fabric of social taboo, woven by generations of custom and moral law began to unravel under the relentless pressure of starvation. The desperation was absolute, a torment that consumed all thought, all feeling, all hope. When the gnawing hunger became a constant suffocating presence, an internal fire that devoured both body and spirit. When the physical pain escalated to an unbearable crescendo, and the mind could no longer reason beyond the immediate, primal need for sustenance. The boundaries that defined human civilization began to blur and then crumble. Communities, once bound by shared customs, by the sanctity of life, and by unspoken rules of conduct, found these foundations eroding under the relentless pressure of starvation. The moral compass, usually guided by generations of tradition, by the teachings of the Church, and by the innate human sense of right and wrong, spun wildly, pointing only toward survival, no matter the cost, no matter the horror it entailed. It was a descent into an abyss where the very definition of food twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. In these extreme circumstances, humanity confronted its most terrifying reflection. The historical accounts from the time, though often deliberately vague, veiled in euphemism, or shrouded in the profound horror of recollection, speak of the ultimate degradation of the human spirit. Without providing any graphic detail, it is universally understood that when all conventional food sources were exhausted, and then all unconventional ones, and then even the previously unthinkable animal sources had disappeared, a terrifying new chapter began. The absolute, undeniable lack of any other option, combined with the profound physical and mental deterioration caused by prolonged starvation, led some individuals, and in rare isolated instances, even small groups, to acts that societies, both then and now, classify as utterly beyond the pale. The sacred boundaries of what was permissible, what was human, were utterly shattered. The very concept of the human being as distinct, as possessing an inherent dignity, was challenged and, in some tragic cases, annihilated by the primal, overwhelming urge to simply continue breathing for one more precious, agonizing day. It was a testament to the sheer, raw power of the survival instinct, overriding all else. Such acts, born of unimaginable, soul-crushing suffering, were never committed lightly. They were the result of a complete and utter breakdown of internal and external safeguards. There was no joy in these desperate measures, no relief that lasted beyond the fleeting moment of consumption. Instead, those who were forced into such desperate choices, and those who witnessed them, carried not only the physical scars of starvation, but also the indelible, invisible marks of the moral compromises they or their neighbors were forced to make. The shame and guilt associated with these experiences, the deep sense of defilement and utter degradation, became a silent, crushing burden that haunted survivors for the remainder of their days. Trust, the invisible glue that binds any community together, fractured irrevocably, often beyond repair. Fear of one another, fear of what humanity itself could become under such unbearable duress, replaced the familiar bonds of kinship, friendship, and neighborhood. The pervasive desperation stripped away not just physical strength and flesh, but also dignity, honor, and the very sense of self, leaving behind hollowed-out individuals. This profound breakdown of moral order was a direct, inescapable consequence of the physical collapse, when the pursuit of food became the single, all-consuming thought, eclipsing every other human need and desire, the intricate web of social interactions, of mutual support, of shared responsibility, and of collective identity simply disintegrated. People became isolated, suspicious, their eyes hollowed by hunger, their movements slow and deliberate, driven by a singular, overriding instinct to preserve their own fragile existence. The human spirit, usually remarkably resilient, capable of enduring immense hardship with dignity, was stretched to a breaking point, and in many, many cases it broke entirely, leaving behind a profound emptiness. The quiet despair that settled over these communities was perhaps more pervasive and more destructive than the loudest cries of hunger, as it signaled the death of hope, the crushing realization that there was no lower point to fall, and that even the most sacred human principles could be brutally sacrificed at the altar of survival. This widespread erosion of social and moral boundaries, this descent into the abyss of absolute necessity, paved the way for the next wave of suffering, a wave born not just of hunger, but of the complete and utter unraveling of the social order itself, leading to widespread illness, chaos, and a world where the rule of law was replaced by the law of the desperate, as the last meager scraps of sustenance vanished, and desperate measures became the horrifying norm. A new insidious enemy began to rise. In the face of such widespread desolation and the breakdown of established order, one might imagine a complete absence of compassion or assistance. Yet, even in these darkest moments, there were glimmers of human effort to alleviate the suffering, though these attempts were often tragically inadequate against the overwhelming tide of hunger and despair. These efforts typically emanated from three primary sources: the monasteries, the feudal lords, and the burgeoning urban centers, each with their own capacities and, more significantly, their inherent limitations. Monasteries, as centers of spiritual life and often significant landowners, were traditionally seen as bastions of charity. Rooted in the Christian imperative to care for the poor and the sick, monastic communities often operated infirmaries and distributed alms to the local populace. During times of famine, their gates would invariably open, offering what meager surplus they possessed from their cultivated lands, and distributing what bread they could bake, often stretching their own supplies to the breaking point. Monks and nuns would tend to the dying, offering spiritual comfort alongside what little physical sustenance they could provide. They were often among the first, and sometimes the only, organized groups to respond, driven by their vows and a deep sense of moral obligation. However, their resources were finite, tied to the productivity of their immediate estates, which were themselves suffering from the same crop failures that afflicted everyone else. A single monastery, no matter how devout or well-intentioned, could only feed a fraction of the starving population in its immediate vicinity, and the sheer scale of the crisis quickly overwhelmed their capacity for charity, turning their granaries into empty shells and their kitchens silent. They could offer solace and a few days' worth of food to a handful of individuals, but they could not stem the tide of regional starvation. Feudal lords, the secular rulers of the land, also had a vested interest in the survival of their populace. Their wealth and power were directly derived from the labor and taxes of their serfs and tenants, and a dead peasantry meant a ruined estate. Furthermore, the feudal contract at least in theory, implied a reciprocal duty of protection and care from lord to vassal. Many lords would indeed open their own stores, distributing grain from their personal granaries or allowing their desperate tenants to forage on their lands, perhaps even waiving some rents or labor obligations for a season. They might organize hunts to provide meat or try to keep local markets functioning, albeit with rapidly dwindling goods. However, the lords themselves were not immune to the economic devastation of crop failures. Their own harvests suffered, their income plummeted, and their primary concerns often revolved around maintaining their military strength and protecting their own immediate families and castles. Any relief they offered was often a calculated measure to prevent widespread revolt or the complete depopulation of their lands, rather than a comprehensive solution to the crisis. Their efforts were piecemeal, largely localized, and ultimately constrained by their own shrinking resources and the inherent self-preservation instincts of a ruling class facing existential threat. The concept of a centralized, coordinated relief effort across multiple lordships was virtually non-existent, leaving each community to largely fend for itself. Urban centers, particularly larger towns and cities, faced a unique set of challenges and responsibilities. As hubs of trade and population, they often maintained public granaries, intended to ensure a stable food supply for their citizens. During a famine, town councils might attempt to regulate prices, restrict grain exports to the countryside, or even purchase grain from more distant regions, if any were available. Guilds, professional associations of craftsmen and merchants, sometimes pooled resources to provide for their members and their families. Civic leaders understood that a starving populace was a volatile one, prone to riots and social unrest. Yet, cities also became magnets for the desperate. As the countryside withered, starving peasants flocked to urban centers, hoping to find food or work, overwhelming the limited resources and sanitation systems of the towns. The influx of refugees rapidly depleted any municipal reserves, drove prices to astronomical levels, and exacerbated the spread of disease. Furthermore, the very market mechanisms that usually supplied cities broke down. There was simply no food to buy, or the cost was so exorbitant that only the wealthiest could afford it, deepening the social divides and fueling resentment. Across all these efforts, the overriding limitations were remarkably consistent. The rudimentary infrastructure of the age, with its unpaved roads and slow animal-drawn transport, meant that even if a distant region had a surplus, moving it to where it was desperately needed was an almost insurmountable logistical challenge. There was no national or international aid system, no centralized government with the capacity to assess the scale of the problem or coordinate a response across vast territories. Communication was slow, information unreliable. Medical knowledge was primitive, offering little help against the diseases that inevitably followed starvation. Moreover, the very understanding of famine was different. It was often viewed as a divine punishment, an act of God, rather than a problem that human organization and intervention could fully mitigate. While individual acts of immense bravery and charity undoubtedly occurred, they were, in the grand scheme, barely a drop in the ocean against the relentless tide of starvation that swept across the continent, leaving millions to their fate with only the most fleeting and localized forms of assistance. The immediate horror of famine, though it eventually receded, left an indelible mark on the medieval world, shaping its future in profound and often surprising ways. The memory of widespread starvation, of the desperate measures taken, served as a grim teacher, forcing communities and rulers alike to confront the inherent fragility of their existence and to seek tangible ways to prevent such catastrophes from recurring. You see, the harsh lessons learned from the Great Famine and other, smaller, but equally devastating